just released it, and we do think it was pretty well received. I mean, basically the goal of the report is to provide some guidelines and some sense of where are the strengths that Africa can build on and the obstacles to be addressed by government, business, civil society in order to improve things on the continent.
The criteria you utilized, I mean, previously I know you've looked at infrastructure concerns, for instance.
Yes, I mean, we look at a variety of factors that go from the more basic to the more complex. So you mentioned infrastructure, also governance is obviously very important. Health and education, really critical issues. The functioning of markets, goods, labor, financial markets, technological adoption, and innovation. So all of these things really do matter for competitiveness.
Let's hone in on the human development aspect, health, education, because we know Africa's got a real skills crisis, but we also know that there's a propensity for people, especially living on the breadline, to not be in a situation where they have social security. And this ties in with WEF's theme for 2011, which is inclusive growth. A lot of people cannot participate in the gains.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, when you talk about inclusive growth, you're basically saying you want to grow, but you want to make sure that employment is generated at the same time. And there are many elements to this. First of all, you have to be sure that your workforce is employable. So that's where it taps into this question of education, training, and there are deficits in this area. There have been improvements in terms of getting kids to school, but what are they learning there, and is the teacher even in the classroom? I mean, that's sometimes the question. And on the other side is the labor market. Do you have a labor market that's allowing business to allocate resources as it needs to do? And in many countries, including South Africa, there are some issues about this.
In many countries, especially South Africa, some people would argue the labor question is a real pressing and hot potato. To what extent will that be discussed here?
Well, it's definitely a big topic. It's something that we discuss within our report, and also it will be discussed here at the World Economic Forum on Africa, because obviously it's something that needs to be addressed. You can talk all you want about, you know, upgrading skills, but if you don't have the sort of labor market that allows for the proper allocation of people, that allows for wage setting that makes sense, and you know, especially when you're talking about some of these countries with 50% or more of youth unemployment, this is a really, really big issue to be addressed.
Infrastructure is also another major issue, especially for investors, because they say that it adds up to 40% of the cost of doing business if they can't just get their goods to market or from one country to another.
Absolutely, and especially in Africa, where you have a lot of perishable goods that you're talking about. And it's not just a question of improving infrastructure in your own country. Obviously, what happens if you build a great road and then you end up at the border and there's nothing on the other side? So obviously this is something that African leaders have been talking about for a long time, but more needs to be done to ensure that you really do build these corridors and that infrastructure projects are cross-border.
Infrastructure is also another major issue, especially for investors, because they say that it adds up to 40% of the cost of doing business if they can't just get their goods to market or from one country to another.
Absolutely, and especially in Africa, where you have a lot of perishable goods that you're talking about. And it's not just a question of improving infrastructure in your own country. Obviously, what happens if you build a great road and then you end up at the border and there's nothing on the other side? So obviously this is something that African leaders have been talking about for a long time, but more needs to be done to ensure that you really do build these corridors and that infrastructure projects are cross-border.
Okay, let's talk about this issue of functioning capital markets, because for many investors this is the limitation. For many SMEs this is the limitation, is value added to their companies and being able to fundraise to grow and expand their companies. There is just a sense that this is a big gaping hole in Africa's development.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we do ask in our executive opinion survey top business leaders across the continent what is the biggest obstacle that they face in doing business, and in most African countries they highlight well above everything else access to capital, lack of access to capital. It's different in South Africa, actually. South Africa has very well functioning capital markets, but in many other parts of the continent, no. And it's not just a question, obviously, of the financial, the formal financial market, but venture capital and all of these things. But clearly, given that there are success stories on the continent, in South Africa, in some other countries, I think there's great learnings that can be done.
I think on this issue, I'd just like to press you a little bit, because we've just seen Ernst & Young coming out with their FDI report, and apparently just last year there were about 300 projects that had foreign investments in Africa. Now we're talking over 630 projects. So there is a sense that the money is coming to Africa.
Absolutely, the money is coming in. We have seen an explosion in FDI over the past few years, but the question is how much more potential is there if some of these issues that we've been discussing get fixed, so to speak. So yes, more FDI coming in, but I mean, this is something that we were just talking talking about earlier, what about domestic investments? A lot of African capital goes outside the country. So it's great to talk about foreigners investing here, but what about Africans investing in Africa?
And this then leads us to the governance issue and my final question. Many African investors would say, we want to keep our money on the continent, we want to retain the talent to the continent, but things have to work, and our leaders have to respect constitutions, and our leaders have to respect the contribution of the business environment, and our property rights have to be secure. So governance, how does Africa fare, comparatively speaking, to the last 10 years? Have we done better or have we regressed?
African countries are definitely doing better. Obviously, it depends. In some countries, there's been a regression, but in most countries, we've seen obviously, peaceful transitions of power, better development of institutions, and this has been very important. But there's still a long way to go, and clearly, this is something that we will be working on a lot over the coming decade.